The Philadelphia sound is usually attributed to two guys that work together, Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. The third person whose name comes up, Tom Bell, also worked with Gamble and Huff, but worked separately from them as well. The Philadelphia sound arises when Gamble and Huff, who had been independent songwriters and producers throughout the late 60s, sometimes releasing records on their own label, sometimes for other labels, but sort of working like a kind of a Lieber and Stoller, say, in black pop, are having hit records when funk really starts to, black pop and funk really start to become a kind of a commercial concern. And CBS Records looks at this and they think, you know, we should really get in the game here. And so they strike a deal with Gamble and Huff that they would establish their own label where they would have control of it, but it would be distributed and essentially sort of owned by CBS. So they would essentially buy, CBS is essentially sort of licensing out a label and giving it to Gamble and Huff and saying, you know, you go with it and see what you can do with it. So they do that, and they establish the label. It's called Philadelphia International. And Philadelphia International Records is responsible for a whole string of important hits through the 1970s that really sort of establish the Philadelphia sound. What is the Philadelphia sound? Well, it features lyrical vocals, often done in a very kind of soulful way that shows the influence of Stax and to a certain degree Motown and gospel roots of a lot of these singers. There's always a driving rhythm section. That's a sort of a common feature of black pop throughout the 70s, so all these different styles will have that. These elegant string arrangements, just Papa Was a Rolling Stone, the Motown track is one like that, but so many of these Philadelphia sound tracks have got this really sort of lush string sound in many ways, going back to what Lieber and Stoller were doing with Sweet Soul at the beginning of the 1960s, right? A kind of a softer approach. The tunes aren't all slow tunes, sometimes they're fast, but they've always got this kind of this string arrangement thing. And as I say before, roots really in the music of, say, the Drifters and Benny King and others like that. So important artists that were produced on this label by Gamble and Huff. We should start with Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, featuring Teddy Pendergrass. A great tune to act as a representative for that group is the tune "If You Don't Know Me By Now," from 1972, number 3 on the pop charts, number 1 on the R&B charts. It's a slow ballad, mellow and sort of very polished in terms of the way the sound is. We've got the soulful lead vocals, but also sort of harmony vocals that kind of come out of the doo-wop tradition. It's a very, as I say, sort of polished, elegant string arrangement that goes with that and really sort of captures a lot of what the Philadelphia sound was. Now, as I go through and give you these chart numbers, I'll again remind you that when I give these pop numbers, I'm talking about records that were on the AM charts. So a track like If You Don't Love Me By Now, even though it was a number 3 hit in 1972, the chances of you ever hearing that on FM rock radio were extremely remote. This was the stuff of AM radio. Even though it was popular and it was high on the charts, it was not happening in the world of rock and rollers. So the only time a rock and roller might have heard this is if they got into their car and somebody had left the car radio on a different station. You know, it wasn't having a lot of penetration into the world of rock and roll. Another Gamble and Huff produced group on Philadelphia International was Billy Paul, Me and Mrs. Jones, a number 1 hit on both the pop and the R&B charts in 1972. Kind of a medium tempo ballad, that one. And Lou Rawls with You'll Never Find Another Love Like Mine, number 1 on the R&B charts, number 2 on the pop charts, and number 9 in 1976. A kind of up-tempo ballad with a bit of a sort of Latin feel. Again, another track that was very, very big on AM radio, and of course Lou Rawls, an important figure in the history of black popular music. Another track we might point to would be Backstabbers by the O'Jays from 1972, which kind of pulls together a kind of a Latin groove together with clear influences that you might hear from the Temptations or the Four Tops from the Motown sound. That kind of thing. And then a track called Love Train, which was kind of a happy, up-tempo kind of tune, and the love train stops at all kinds of different cities. So they're sort of talking about all these cities all around the world. Get on the love train, right? Not unlike Back in the USA or something like that from the Beach Boys, calling out all these different tunes. Again, that was a #1 hit both on the R&B and the pop charts, went to #9 in the UK. The thing about the Gamble and Huff thing at Philadelphia International was they had, like Motown did, like Stax did, a backing band that played on a lot of these recordings. And the name of the group was called MFSB, which stood for Mother, Father, Sister, Brother. And they played on a lot of these records. So when I say Gamble and Huff kind of pulled together to a certain extent what James Brown and Sly Stone had done in funk, you can also see them acting an awful lot like Berry Gordy Jr. in the way they're running this record label. They've got their writers, their producers, their performers, and then they've got their studio band. The big track for MFSB, they did instrumental tracks as well, is a song called TSOP, The Sound of Philadelphia is what that stands for. #1 on both the pop and the R&B charts. It's an instrumental track except for some background vocals by a group called The 3 Degrees. It ended up becoming the theme for the television show Soul Train, and we'll talk about Soul Train in just a minute. Well, Thom Bell had also worked with Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, doing as a producer and arranger for Philadelphia International Records, but he also did his own work as a freelancer. And so we'll talk for a minute about some of the groups that he produced as a freelancer away from Philadelphia International Records, but still representative of the Philadelphia sound. Let's start with the Spinners, who had recorded for Motown but moved to Atlantic Records in 1972. So here's Thom Bell working with the Philadelphia sound with the Spinners, but it's appearing on Atlantic Records. Representative examples of that: I'll Be Around from 1972, or Could It Be I'm Falling in Love from 1972 as well. Also, Thom Bell worked with the Stylistics. They recorded for Avco Records. And what's interesting about those tunes is a couple of the big hits were actually written by Thom Bell along with Linda Creed. Those two tracks would be Betcha by Golly, Wow from 1972, and You Make Me Feel Brand New from 1974. So when you put all this music together, you get a pretty good idea of what constituted the Philadelphia sound in the first half of the 1970s. And of course, the chart performance of these Philadelphia soundtracks, sound records on the AM charts, the AM pop, the pop charts, which primarily played on AM radio, and the R&B charts, is just a fantastic success. Let's take just a minute as we think about this to mention the television show Soul Train, which was in many ways kind of the Black American Bandstand. We talked on the first half of the course about American Bandstand and how important it was for establishing a kind of a place on television for kids in the late 50s and throughout the 60s to sort of see pop music. And then we talked about how that expanded into other kinds of television in the second half of the decade, shows like Shindig and Hullabaloo and Where the Action Is. In 1970, the show debuted in Chicago, sponsored by Sears, of course Sears Roebuck having its headquarters in Chicago, and really sort of targeted at a black audience. I mean, there was really no intention to sort of broaden out the appeal or crossover. They had a pretty good idea of what their target audience was, and that was African American music listeners. And so the show set up very much like American Bandstand. And it was hosted by a fellow named Don Cornelius, who really became kind of the Dick Clark of American pop, African American pop during the 1970s and into the 1980s. After having good success there in Chicago, they moved to syndication, national syndication in 1971. And when that happened, they moved the operation out to Los Angeles. Interestingly, and this tells you a lot about the marketing, they were sponsored by Johnson Products, but the product that Johnson Products wanted to promote on Soul Train was a whole line of hair care products for African Americans called Afro Sheen, right? And lots of times, especially when you're looking at American television, you can tell who the target audience is by who the commercials seem to be most directed at. And in this case, it was very clear that you were seeing a lot of black pop, and you were seeing hair care products that were designed especially for an African American population. And this is really what a Soul Train was. As I said before, the theme music by MFSB was the Sound of Philadelphia, the TSOP, lots of letters here, the TSOP track. Soul Train ran for 35 years until 2006. Don Cornelius hosted it until 1993. According to the sources that I consulted, it still holds the record for the longest running television show in syndication, and will into maybe 2014, 2015, 2016. There are a couple of other shows that may hit 35 by that time. But anyway, a fantastically successful television show. Well, we've mentioned these blaxploitation movies a couple of times already. So in the next video, let's turn to the blaxploitation films.